Hello, 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 and welcome back to the Heal with Kat podcast. My name is Kat, and I am your host, and I am so excited to be back on another episode, on another week. And this is week 3 now of the podcast upgrade. And man, oh man, it has been such a humbling experience, honestly. I have been learning so much about myself through this whole process. And it's funny in some way to think about this, but I'm just going to own it. I really do have a need to be seen. Ugh, I'm cringing, but I'm going to own it. I mean, I feel like there's so many people in the world who crave to be seen or need to be seen, and they don't own it because they think that it's selfish or narcissistic, attention seeking. And the truth is that if you know me, there are many situations in which I do not like attention and I don't like being seen for reasons that are very valid. And then there's kind of this internal stirring inside of me that's kind of like, hey, it's like this little voice. It feels like my higher self, but it's kind of like this inner knowing within me. And it's like, hey, you have a lot to say. You have a lot to say with your purpose. You need to get comfortable being seen and desire it so you can call it in. Because outside of like work stuff, I am such an introvert hermit at home. Like, yes, I like to go out and go to dinner and like do fun things here and there, but I do genuinely like love to just be in my own energy, in my own space, and just kind of be cozy. The only time that I really allow myself to be seen is through work. And I'm trying to really channel that in ways that are purposeful and helpful for others. On the same side of that coin of wanting to be seen is, like I said, kind of a deep fear of being seen. And I have to juggle those two things being true at the same time. And that's been really difficult and vulnerable. I think many of us crave certainty in our lives, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to feel important. These are some of the core needs that we have as humans that I'm going to get into in today's episode, which is all about the topic of belonging. And if you've been around for a while, you know I talk a lot about this because this is one of the most fundamental, basic teachings in family constellation therapy. And for today's episode, for the sake of how long the modality name is, I'll be abbreviating it as FCT. The reason belonging is so fundamental to not only family constellation therapy, but to our basic human experience is because belonging is a core need of all human beings. Belonging satisfies our inner primal need for connection, acceptance, and community. And the benefits of feeling like we belong in healthy ways to our families and our jobs and our communities and friends, when it's in true alignment for us, can show up physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, socially. Like having a true sense of belonging can give us more confidence in our purpose, in our relationships, and our identity, and even with the topic of resilience. And belonging can be a really nice buffer for us, like a really nice kind of cloud to fall back on when we're going through adversity, which can create separateness. So when there's conflict with other people, there's something about conflict that is naturally separating. You know, it kind of takes two people apart. When that happens, our sense of belonging can feel like it's totally gone, it's dead, like it's a life or death sometimes, especially for people with a more anxious attachment. So belonging is a secure way for us to feel that, like feel a sense that even when things aren't perfect, we still matter. And when we feel connected to others and supported by our community or our families or friends or jobs or bosses or whatever, we are better equipped to cope with stress, to overcome challenges, and to bounce back from setbacks. So there are so many benefits in the concept, in the feeling, in the embodiment of belonging. And a long time ago, someone told me about the 6 core needs of each human being. Without these 6 core needs, we start to develop survival, coping, protection, and defense mechanisms to keep us alive. Mostly survival, but again, I'm not going to like I'm not going to put it into a box. There's many people out there who experience all of these mechanisms when their core needs are not being met. And usually the core needs are not being met for a reason, whether they're traumatic or not. They don't have to be traumatic, they can be circumstantial. But here are the 6 core needs of human beings. The first one is certainty. Certainty gives us assurance that we can avoid pain and gain pleasure. Certainty gives us a sense of grounding that we belong. Number 2 is variety. Variety gives us the tools to manage the unknown. Variety helps us become more resilient, and it also helps us with our adaptive development in how we move through and experience change. This is kind of a side note, but if you're somebody that really struggles with change and the unexpected and the unknown, and you tend to run more anxious, whether you know it or not, ask your mom or somebody that was present at your birth if you had any birth trauma. Just a little side note. Usually, that's the first major experience we go through in our human experience where change and unexpected new stimuli obviously come up. We've been in the womb for 9 months. We come out, and if it's been traumatic and if our travel from womb to outside of the womb was not safe, that can leave an imprint on our subconscious, on our body, and on our spirit. The third one is significance. Feeling unique, feeling important, feeling special or needed. So many children really, really need to feel significant and important because it means that they have a role in the family system. If children feel unimportant, neglected, abandoned, that is a wound that will live with them forever, and it'll affect all their relationships. And they will continue to search outside themselves for that importance because it never came from within themselves and in the home. The fourth one is connection and love. This is having a strong feeling of closeness or a union with someone or something. Just that connection of closeness, like that's what really creates a lot of secure attachment. And it's also what helps us feel that we matter and that we belong. Number 5 is growth, the capability to understand things and intellectually develop, also physically develop, like expansion of capacity, just being stretched and moved to our edge and knowing that it's okay and that we're safe. That need for growth also helps us believe that we are moving towards something, and that movement towards something gives us stability in knowing that we are accomplishing goals. Growth gives us confidence. Like there's so many benefits to being in a growth mindset. But in order to be in a growth mindset, we need to experience growth in order to know what that is like. Because the minute that we start to experience growth and we've never had that core need met, we're going to freak out and it's going to trigger us and we're going to think that we're not good enough and then we're going to spiral. And that's not the case at all. Life is just stretching us to continue to grow. And the last one, number 6, is contribution, is to feel part of a community and to feel like they're giving back. So I like to think that if we were to create a sub-core needs in this list, like if we were to kind of look at all of the similarities between these core needs, belonging would be filed under a few of them, like certainty, connection, significance, right? All those things. So by definition, the word belonging in the Cambridge Dictionary means a feeling of being happy or comfortable as a part of a particular group and having a good relationship with other members of the group because they welcome and accept you. And the Cambridge Dictionary literally says a sense of belonging is one of humanity's most basic needs. It is so, so true. Similarly, in family constellation therapy, belonging is the way that we feel we matter in our family system. But the difference in that is that in FCT, we are looking at all the ways we belong, even if it's not in our highest and best good. It means that sometimes in order to cling to the belonging we need to feel in our families, that we matter, that we're significant, that we are loved, that there's connection, like all these basic needs, We will do it in ways that are not helpful or good for us just because everybody else is doing it. So here's an example I use often. If you come from a family of normalized or functional alcoholics and you decide to get sober and stop drinking, your family may not handle it very well. Like they may very well stop inviting you to dinner parties or events or gatherings. Or if they do invite you, they may make comments about you getting sober as if you're all of a sudden like different from them. And it's not said in a supportive way, or it may be even more passive aggressive than that, but you just know they're treating me differently. And also, I feel different from these people. Sometimes getting sober, even if it's the best thing for our health and well-being, will create separation with our functional alcoholic family, or even just family that really likes to drink and have a good time. And then you feel that you don't belong anymore. You know that you're different from them. And that difference can feel really threatening. It can take us right out of survival mode, and it'll put us right in our bodies. And if we don't feel safe to be in these bodies and make decisions and have choices and be in our desires, we may constantly battle with going back and forth between the family. Our sense of belonging when we're a child is reliant on our survival. Okay, I just want to repeat that again. Our sense of belonging when we're a child is reliant on our survival. We need to feel we belong in order to survive. Even though as babies and children, we need belonging in order to survive, when we become adults, we have far more free will and choice to belong or not. The hard part is that we often handicap ourselves in one way or another to belong. So this may mean that we may choose to become sober curious, right? And still dabble in drinking around the family just so that they don't say anything or think that we're weird or that we feel different from them, even though we know deep down we just need to stop and we want to stop. Like instead of leaning into our desires 100%, we will dabble in the old dynamics just enough to get that approval, and then we'll stop. And by doing that, we're actually manipulating ourselves and we're manipulating our family, and we're going against ourselves and our desires just to fit in. Cycle breakers, previously who have identified with the idea of being the black sheep in the family, I think it's kind of a journey. You start as the black sheep and you kind of move into cycle breaker. But these cycle breakers have a choice more than ever before to either stay stuck in the trauma or to heal it and move on without it. And in that difficulty is the knowing that if we do move on without the trauma, we may not belong with our families. Belonging is the first thing I will look for in a family constellation therapy. And the biggest question I'm asking myself by listening to the client talk to me is, how is the client belonging to their family system with a pattern, behavior, a choice, a thing, whatever it is? What is the way that they are belonging? For example, if your mom married an alcoholic and got divorced, and then you married an alcoholic and you're contemplating getting divorced, this is something where you're belonging with your mom in this unconscious pattern. And it's the craziest part about FCT because it truly is unconscious. Even though we kind of think, oh, maybe this has to do with it, it literally comes from the family system. And behaviors have a lot to do with belonging and fitting in and the fear of being the black sheep. And that is truly often the unconscious part. And this is in every family system. So like, please do not sit here and listen to this or watch this and think like, oh my gosh, like I have the worst family. I have the worst family in the world. Like every single person, human being on this planet, until they start waking up to the things that are running their lives due to family trauma, they will continue belonging in ways that aren't healthy because it's just our way to survive. It's the only way we know how. It really is. Like we can't beat ourselves up for this stuff, really, because we didn't know better. And you know what? My favorite saying is, you don't know what you don't know sometimes. You truly cannot expect perfection from yourself in this healing journey because you're just going to keep bogging yourself down when the whole journey of healing is about lifting yourself up and growing. So don't get down on yourself if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, Kat is talking about all these crazy things with belonging, and I'm still doing this. And guess what, guys? I am still doing them too. I do. And I catch myself when I'm doing it. And I'm looking for approval. I'm looking for significance. I'm looking for validation. I'm looking for whatever it is. We're just human. This is an ever evolving journey. So just please know that. So, after that big introduction of belonging, I'm actually going to share with you some of the biggest areas in our lives that show the ways that we will belong to our families, even if it's not in our highest and best good. My ask for you is take what resonates and leave the rest. Allow this information to inspire you in your healing journey. And if something doesn't resonate with you, you can just skip right over it. If anything, it's just helpful to know. So let's start with childhood. I look for anyone with trauma under 10 years old may have had like big breaks in the bond with their families, such as like the womb experience, or if there's like womb trauma, being in the NICU, a death, or having long breaks away from your parents, which causes trauma. So in childhood, let's just say that you were born in a traumatic way and you had to go to the NICU, or there was something where your birth experience was not pleasant and warm and lovely and safe. Okay. So in the case of the NICU, there's a lot of felt sense of being left and abandoned with clients. So just to briefly touch on the topic of felt sense, it's a somatic feeling in your body that you know you experienced something, but you may not remember it. So it's this kind of like intuitive felt sense in your body. I actually did a mini episode on the felt sense. It's number 39. It's about 10 minutes long, all about the felt sense. So if you want to hear more about the felt sense experience and what that's like, go listen to that one after this. But yeah, so there's that felt sense after the NICU of being left and abandoned. And if you experienced being in the NICU as a child and you come to a family constellation session, we would have to move really, really slow with sessions because it could be difficult for you to move away from the old connection to the family through abandonment. Because the way that you learned to belong to your family at the moment of birth was to be away from them. And so your nervous system, your subconscious, your body got used to that separation from your family. And that's the way that your body learned what connection may be like. So I had a client who shared with me that they were hospitalized for a serious illness at 3 years old. And they were kept in the hospital by themselves with nurses for almost 2 years. And he was only allowed to see his family on Sundays for like 2 hours. And we had to work on this break in the bond of belonging for a few sessions to really address the root feelings here. We had to address this experience a handful of times because it kept showing up in his relationships, his work, his self-worth. And I think at some point he even said, we've worked on this before. Like, why do we go back to that? And I said, yeah, we have worked on this before, and we have to keep unlayering where it's relevant because clearly there's something still stuck here. The hard part about the NICU or, being like under 5 years old or even under 10 years old is we're so young, like we don't remember. So if you've ever been in an FCT with me and you know the experience of being on the papers and channeling the energy of what that paper represents, many times I'm looking for trauma under 10 to show up below the knees in the constellation. So if someone's on a paper and they say my feet or my knees really hurt or ache, that's really a sign for me that there's trauma under 10 years old that we have to look at. In childhood, abuse or adoption can also have a huge impact on the way that we feel that we belong. And these two examples can wreck the sense of safety within a child. Because in both situations, the child or the felt sense of the child is, if mom and dad aren't here, how do I survive? And so what's interesting is with adoption can sometimes create a false sense of safety because there was no bonding with the biological mother, the mother that the baby spent 9 months in the womb with and got used to its feelings, the mother's nervous system, the scent of the mother, like all the different things that a baby connects to within the womb in a mother. And as they grow up into adulthood, their sense of safety is always at the hands of someone else, as they're constantly searching for mom and dad. And the ways that they deal with looking for that safety may show up with addiction as well. So then that becomes generational, because every generation is looking for, how do I survive? How do I survive? And the best way to escape those feelings and to self-soothe and cope can be through addiction. And I think this is why I really believe that, aside from the obvious reasons of why it can be freeing for adopted children to finally meet their biological parents, a big reason why I think it's so just freeing and liberating for them is because it gives them a sense of identity, and it roots connections to where they come from and who they are. And their body literally has a resonance with the person that carried them for 9 months, or even the father. There's just that energetic resonance of belonging to a family system. And that's not to say that there's adopted people out there who don't feel that they don't belong. There's plenty. But there's something to be said for the biological connection that we share with our mothers and our fathers. We talked about that a little bit earlier. In family constellation therapy, we have a really unique term for another kind of enmeshed relationship. So I'm going to do my best to explain this, and hopefully the metaphors that I use will be supportive in you understanding it. Merging is similar to enmeshment, because merging and enmeshment both signify that something is stuck together. There's very little sense of self or autonomy and very little boundaries. So merging and enmeshment are similar in that way. However, the main difference is that enmeshment usually involves a lack of boundaries and autonomy, where like people struggle to maintain a separate sense of self within a relationship, but the lines are blurred. Okay, so enmeshment is like a big gray area. Like if I were to just like show you a big gray cloud, that's what enmeshment is. It's like, oh, no one knows who they are, and everyone's kind of like just heads in the cloud, confusion. Like, am I you? Are you me? How are we connected with each other? Is it too close? It feels too close. There's no boundaries here. It's like a big question mark. Merging, on the other hand, it involves actively and purposefully blending identities and experiences to create a sense of unity within a relationship. So you can think of merging as somebody literally shooting an arrow at another family member and saying, I need this for connection. It's like the lines are crossed on purpose. There's no like maybes or like, oh, I don't know. Like there may be question marks, but merging is much more purposeful. It's like, I'm going to do this because my dad did it. I'm going to do this because my mom did it. It's like much more directional. In regards to belonging in relationships, if a child merges with a parent for belonging and safety, if they are purposefully taking on the identity and the experiences of their parent in order to belong, then the child will grow into an adult who has a very hard time making decisions, because they won't learn how to trust themselves. They won't know how to make their own choices or decisions, and they will constantly lean on others for advice or direction. A lot of people also who are active in merging unconsciously as a child are people who don't have a sense of who they are and don't understand what their sense of self is or what autonomy is. If you're somebody who struggles with feeling overly responsible for others, taking too much responsibility for things, always making yourself wrong for the other person to be right to avoid conflict, that's usually a sign that there's merging with your mother, and it shows me that there's a mother wound there that could really benefit from some healthy boundaries and separation. So those are the ways that it shows up in childhood. We look to belong to our families because we go through these traumatic things that we may not remember, and we are doing our best to survive. Here are other areas outside of childhood that this can show up. And we're going to go into some really interesting kind of topics, like the first one, which is gangs. So interesting. My mentor used to talk about clients that she had in LA who were in gangs, who would find her an FCT. And she said that people in gangs will commit these horrible crimes and act out against other human beings just to feel that they are accepted and that they belong. And it's so heinous how deeply the body holds on to this trauma for belonging. And she told me that the only time she ever saw someone physically throw up or vomit on the papers in the field during a session is when murder in gangs was involved. The fact that the gang member was having to separate from the gang and, renounce the murder and the crimes and all the things, it was so jarring for his body because gangs are so tight in like blood that it literally made him sick in the field. So it literally takes a physical toll on the body in the ways that we belong with people that are not in our highest and best good. It can make us sick. Money is always such an interesting topic to talk about with family constellation therapy because there's obviously such a hype around money. Like, people just put so much emphasis on money, and half the time when people come into an FCT session for money, we don't even end up talking about money. We don't even work on money itself. It's like so many other things. But what I'm looking for in a family constellation with somebody who's really adamant about working with money is, what kind of socioeconomic class did your family come from? And are you looking to be different from them in that way? And if you are, if whether it's more money or less money or whatever, is that threatening your ability to do that because you're afraid that you won't bond and belong with your family? Similarly, people will stay typically in the same socioeconomic class as their family as a way to bond and belong. So you hear this with celebrities and athletes a lot. Like, when they come from poverty or low income homes and then they find themselves in wealth of any kind, they will usually feel unworthy of it. And they'll usually blow the money. Like, it'll just be gone. Like, they won't know how to hold on to it. Think about how many times that we've heard this with people. It doesn't even have to be like celebrities or athletes. I want you to think about where you came from in your family system. People are so keen on manifesting money and doing these like big money workshops and manifestation practices to call in money. And sometimes the money comes, but usually the money won't stay. Sometimes people feel so unworthy of wealth or money because they never had it growing up and their families never had it, that they can never call it in and keep it. And this is why money is one of the top things people come to me for. Sometimes we do work on money itself if I feel like the client's done enough work on themselves around money and their belief systems around money. But sometimes we end up looking at the money trauma in the family to explain why things are the way that they are. So let's just say, like, your great grandfather had a business and he, committed a crime and lost all his money and went to jail. Or if your family like had, a lot of money and then the stock market crashed and then they lost all their money, like, and then they lived a completely different life. Like, we have to look at all of the money trauma in the family to explain why things are the way that they are today if they haven't been healed and acknowledged. So if you've tried to manifest money and you keep hitting blocks with it and you know that there's an ancestral tie, FCT would be deeply beneficial for you because you may not be able to move forward with money because you're still belonging to the old money story. In fact, if you find yourself saying, I'm doing everything right and money is not coming, absolutely come to a family constellation therapy session and be prepared for me to ask you if there is slavery or war trauma in the family system. These are most definitely connected to money trauma because with money, we're looking at how can money, in the highest regard of money, how can we help people have a relationship with money that feels fulfilling? Like, that's what we want to have. That's the relationship we're working towards with money. I do this thing. It feels good for me. I'm receptive to money coming in for me to continue being in alignment with money. And I'm calling it in because it feels good and I don't feel guilty for it. And like all the different beliefs, like money needs to feel fulfilling. No matter if it's $10 or $1,000, that money has to feel worthy and enough for you. And if $100, $1,000, $1,000,000 is never enough for you, what are you chasing? And with slavery and war trauma, if money was made in our family system at the cost of someone else or many people's lives, it will never feel fulfilling. And slavery is a component of that. And you'd be shocked, but yes, slavery does show up in people's family systems still. Romantic relationships is a really big topic, okay? It's like probably, aside from money, like another really big topic that people come to me for, especially for people my age in their 30s and 40s who say they quote unquote still haven't found love. Love is actually my favorite topic to talk about. Like, I just love love and I'm all about it. And I want to be surrounded by love 24/7. My Venus is in Pisces, so I'm kind of a hopeless romantic in many ways. And so working on relationships is really fascinating for me, but also it's been a huge part of my life as well. You know, being in a relationship for 9 years, getting divorced, looking for love and finding it. It's just a topic I'm quite well skilled at talking about. But with romantic relationships, people might sabotage relationships if everyone in their family is either single or divorced. So if there's divorce in a family system, it could be a red flag for emotional, physical, verbal, or sexual abuse in the family system, because divorce is a break in the bond that we have with our partners and our family. But friends, please keep in mind, this is not a one size fits all. And actually, none of this information is today. This is just general information that we look to with family constellation therapy to try to decipher where trauma might be stuck for somebody in the family system. But every situation is so nuanced. So just because you may be on a date with a guy and you hear that his parents are divorced, it doesn't mean that you start assuming the worst. Part of my job in FCT is to get really curious and ask respectful and thoughtful questions with clients to understand their family story through their eyes. So if you're on that date and this guy is telling you, or girl, about their family's divorce and all of this stuff, I invite you to do the same if it feels appropriate with them. And so much closeness and intimacy can be built in those vulnerable questions and moments, and follow your heart with it. The more you get to understand why people's families are the way that they are, you'll understand the person that's in front of you a lot more too. So, or this could even be if you're not estranged from your family, like even if you're just unaware of what's going on and let's just say you haven't been in a relationship in a long time, look at your friends and your inner circle to see what relationship dynamics and patterns are playing out that could be holding you back from finding love. I had a client once who didn't speak to her father because he cheated on her mother when she was young, and they moved to a different country and the father was left behind in the country. And the mother of my client told my client when she was a child that her father was a horrible person, like all these horrible comments about the father, that he hadn't been a great husband, hadn't been a great father. And the child at a very young age knew all the things that had happened in the relationship. And everything that she heard was horrible. And even though the client's father had not cheated on the child, it felt like she took on that pain of, my dad cheated, quote unquote, on me, or, abandoned me, or I'm not good enough, because the mother was just making all of her problems the client's problems. So there's the enmeshment there's the entanglement. All of a sudden, the child doesn't know if she's herself or if she's mom. And you could say that there's even some identification going on here. So when the client came to me, she was really struggling, and she was struggling mostly with an eating disorder. It started when she was a very young age, and she could not seem to understand why, despite all of her best efforts, she could not stop her eating disorder. After we did some digging, we found that her belonging and her loyalty to her mother was so, so, so deep from that divorce that by proxy, because those lines were blurred, she took on her mother's problems, including her mother's eating disorder. And the reason she could not stop is because her biggest subconscious fear is that if she stopped, she would not be connected to her mom anymore. And because she didn't have a father to lean on, and she didn't want to put that burden on her husband or her children, she continued to put it on herself. So when we were in the field and I asked her in the healing statements to give it back to her mom, she was silent. She couldn't even get the words out. She couldn't say, "Mom, I give this back to you with love. I can't carry your pain anymore. Your pain is not my own, whatever it was. She was just silent. And I just sat there thinking, God, Catherine, this is such a vulnerable situation. Like, I mean, we've moved really slow. Should I be moving slower? Like, it is, I have goosebumps talking about this. The way that she belonged to her mother wasn't just through the divorce, that was the beginning. It was through the eating disorder. And eventually, we were able to create enough separation in that session where she was able to feel that she could stop identifying with some of the food addictive behaviors. And we did a few sessions together. And then I think at the end, I was like suggesting somatic therapy and EMDR and some other body based work. But unfortunately, just as we were hitting the root cause of the identification and the enmeshment and the merging, I never heard from her again. And this is really common. And I don't take it personally. Like, I really have to say, like, I do not take it personally because I'm asking people to confront some of their deepest and scariest fears. And it doesn't mean that she's not a cycle breaker because she did break some cycles. And it doesn't mean that she's not strong or capable. It just means that whatever root cause we got to was very, very confronting for her. And maybe FCT wasn't supportive for her anymore. And maybe, hopefully, she has gone into somatic therapy or EMDR. But the hope is that we want to create enough healthy separation that her mother's experience doesn't have to be her own. She can be who she's meant to be in this life. So, speaking of eating disorders and food, I talked about this on last week's episode number 41, which is the unconscious tie between weight issues and abuse. But food and weight, the way that we will belong to our families in ways that don't serve us with food and weight, will be tied to health issues in the family, any abuse or sexual trauma. And I talked last week about that unexpected connection between weight and abuse. And I noted in that podcast episode a PubMed article that studied females who had been sexually abused as children and how it affected their weight over time. And the study noted that while there was no difference in weight in their childhood and teenage years, as they became adults, when they started to see the shift in difficulty losing weight, they were gaining it more quickly. And it was usually happening after they had children. So while food and weight, it's not limited to sexual abuse, this can show up with physical as well. And again, I talk about this in episode number 41. But food and weight struggles can be used as a safety and protection mechanism. So aside from the fact that people will use food to emotionally self-soothe, right? Like addiction to food, it's definitely like a coping mechanism. More trauma-oriented people who identify as the quote-unquote shock absorber in their family system can also experience struggles with weight and with food. And the idea is that they will carry the weight as a protective barrier between them and their abuser. And that's how they will belong to the family system, is that fear that if they separate from the trauma, like it's not that they're thinking, oh God, what's going to happen if I'm separate from this person? What they're thinking is, what's going to happen to me on the other side of this? Because I've identified with this trauma for so long. Who am I going to be without it? And we build our identity off of our trauma so much and the things that have happened to us that just the mere idea of not identifying it with anymore doesn't feel safe in the body, and we don't know what's on the other side. So we will just stay enmeshed and belong with it. It's the really fucked up way that our subconscious and our body will look for survival, but it is what it is. If you really want to go deeper on this, go to episode number 41. I spent an entire hour talking about this topic in detail, and I even share client stories and even a personal story where abuse and weight were connected. So yeah, check that out if that seems like it could hit home for you. And lastly, with food and weight, it's really common that people who wake up at a random age and they all of a sudden have like these bizarre food allergies and develop these like overnight concerning food habits. Like all of a sudden they wake up and they're just like, oh God, I can't eat that anymore. I need to do this or I need to do that. We need to look at the family's health patterns. We need to look at your age in the family system where any trauma happens. So if you're 33 and you wake up one day and all of a sudden you have these crazy bizarre food allergies, or you have this really bizarre paranoia or fear around food, we need to look at what happened at that age in other people in your family. It doesn't even have to be mom or dad or grandma and grandpa. It could be aunts, uncles, cousins, could be anything. And that's directly tied to epigenetics. So yes, there's an energetic part of FCT, but there's also an epigenetic part to it. So I've talked a little bit about addiction earlier in the episode, but I'm going to touch on it just again because there's so much to say about it. Addiction is one of the most complex traumas that we can address in ourselves and in the family system because there's so many layers to it. But if someone in the family gets sober and relapses, okay, let's just say they can't stay sober. They're often trying to belong to the previous generation of addicts. And I want to clarify very, very clearly. Addiction is not always drugs or alcohol. It could be your phone, social media, food, relationships, sex, work, business, pornography, whatever it is. Simplified without oversimplifying addiction, but the simplified version is that addiction is the way that we try to self-soothe and escape. And it's interesting because it's not uncommon that a sober client will say, I will never be like my mom or dad who is an addict. But with some digging, we find out that there's another addiction showing up differently. And people will always find ways to check out and escape, even if it doesn't look like the generations of addicts before them. So this is just a humbling way of kind of just looking within and just being like, all right, so I'm noticing I'm doing this thing. I'm needing to self-soothe. I kind of want to escape my body, my brain, my human experience right now. Okay, so health. This one's going to take a bit of a turn, and we're going to explore a few health dynamics that show up with health and belonging. So, you guys have heard of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, right? If you haven't, I'm going to quote who she is. Gypsy Rose Blanchard gained notoriety as a victim turned perpetrator in a high-profile case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Born to Dee Dee Blanchard, Gypsy was subjected to unnecessary medical treatments and forced to portray herself as terminally ill and disabled for years, even when she wasn't. In 2015, Gypsy orchestrated the murder of her mother with her then boyfriend, Nicholas Godejohn, as an attempt to escape her abusive situation. This case garnered widespread attention and sparked discussions about caregiver manipulations and the complexities of victimhood. When I heard the story about what happened with Gypsy and Dee Dee, I literally was like, holy shit, I need to understand. I am so intrigued by the dynamics that are happening in this relationship. And I think the most fucked up part about that whole story is that there are parents with severe mental illness who pose as like non-threats on society. And those same parents can literally create illness to keep their children enmeshed, identified, merged, or belonged with them. Like that's what we saw in this extreme case with Gypsy Rose and Dee Dee Blanchard, where Dee Dee created illness in Gypsy to keep her close for her own self-serving benefits. And I'd be so damn curious to understand Dee Dee and her life more to see where the desperate need for belonging came from. So opening up my DMs, if you know anything about this, or if you saw anything interesting on Instagram or TikTok, please, I'll link my Instagram in the show notes. Tell me what you know. Share with me the information because I'm so fascinated by this dynamic. However, stemming off of that, there's another unhealthy dynamic with health and like physical health and well-being. And it's that parents will actually keep themselves sick and they'll create illness in themselves to keep their kids close. And again, these are really extreme situations, but this is what can happen. And this is deep, deep, deep victimhood energy. Like toxic victimhood. It's like the kind of victimhood that doubles as severe narcissism. And the crazy thing is that it doesn't have to be something like cancer or debilitating illness. If a parent acts like they are constantly sick or they're constantly a victim to their bodies or to circumstances to manipulate a situation in their favor with health, that's a red flag. Obviously, we didn't all see parents who were totally healthy and took care of themselves 100% growing up, okay? Like we need to hold space for that. We may have seen our parents act or behave or consume unhealthy things without regard for their health. That doesn't mean that they're trying to manipulate you. they could genuinely have not seen health growing up in their lives or feel worthy to be healthy. They got into a pattern of something and now they just can't stop. And maybe now it's a little bit of an addiction because it helps them take the edge off or whatever it is. But if they use it as a means to stay close to you and have a relationship with you through the illness, that is where it's really tricky and it can be really hard. So with this stuff, you guys trust your gut. You will know if a parent is manipulating their health to keep you close and prevent you from being your own person. You will just know. It's a felt sense in your body. So how this affects you as a child is that you will not experience wellness, joy, or happiness because you've been enmeshed in this manipulative dynamic. And now in your mind, in your body, you rely on your mom to survive. And if your mom can't do it in a healthy, loving, and joyful way, you're also going to take that on. So you're going to become unconsciously bonded and enmeshed and merged with your mother's lack of health. So the mother's lack of health will become the child's lack of health. And this is not just a physiological sense of survival. It's also unhealthy energetic cords that are created between the mother and the child. So then the child will grow up and have tons of health issues with no resolve, and they won't understand why they don't feel motivated to get better, or they'll become lazy about getting healthy or taking care of themselves. And this is when you know there's something enmeshed with mother or father around health, and there may have been manipulation energy where the parent kept themselves sick in order to keep a child close. This happens so frequently with autoimmune disease. Maybe a parent did not realize that they weren't helping you be healthy and they were keeping you stuck in that way because they didn't have health themselves. So you, as the inner child, you may not feel that you're allowed to experience a healthy body if your parents did not. I just want to note too that going back to the giving our parents the benefit of the doubt with health, our parents may not realize that they're keeping us stuck with being healthy. I'll share a personal experience, which is vulnerable to share, but it might give some context to all the different kinds. I'm trying to give different examples of all the ways that health and belonging show up. For me personally, I had endometriosis my whole life. From the time I first got my period, within that first year at 10 years old, I was fainting from period cramps, throwing up, in debilitating pain. And no one ever took me to the doctor or the hospital for it, ever. It was just, well, your grandma has it. It must be that you have it too. Here's some medication. We'll just wait for this to pass. And as a child, I needed more. I needed someone to really be an advocate for me because I couldn't understand what was happening in my body. My parents did not purposefully try to keep me sick. They just didn't know how to handle the situation. They were doing their best to handle what I was going through. And although as a child I needed more of an advocate, it doesn't mean that they weren't equipped enough to support me. They supported me as much as they could. And then I needed more, and that's okay. But my parents didn't purposely try to keep me sick. However, because I didn't have the help and the advocacy and the support that I really needed, that I wasn't able to communicate as a child, I feel that that is why it took me close to 15 years to finally get to a place where I understood what this disease is and how to heal it in my body. And so you could say, in a way, that unintentionally my parents blocked my ability to be healthy and find, a resolve for this, right? But it wasn't that they did it on purpose. It's just that, one, my mom never went through it and it was normalized by whatever my grandma went through. And maybe she never saw my grandma go through period cramps. So she didn't really have like a true understanding of it. And my dad really probably didn't understand it either. Endometriosis is not on that side of the family. And he probably leaned on my mom for understanding. And my mom may have been like, just give her a couple Tylenol or Advil or Aleve and it should be done. I had to go through healing the endometriosis in my body in my own way. And I believe that what happened was in my highest and best good. And I don't blame my parents for it, but I'm still allowed to say, I wish things were different. But also, I'm grateful for the journey that I've been on. And I'm discovering a lot about myself through this whole journey. And that's really important for me so that I don't pass certain cycles on. All right, so let's get into the topic of career and work. It's really common that people will stay in jobs and businesses to bond and belong with their family. I did this in some ways with working in my family's business, but not in all ways because that job was a total blessing for me. But where it would have become problematic is if I continued to work there for like years, even though I knew it wasn't aligned for me anymore because of my fear of not belonging or judgment or unapproval if I left. So I think the moment that I found FCT and then the time that I actually left between that was like a year and a half. But essentially, people will settle for jobs for less than what they believe they deserve or what is aligned for them or what they truly desire because of what their parents do for a living. And this isn't true with everyone. You see a lot of generational businesses out there where children are very happy to work in the family business. But, we could use the example of like the janitor's son. The janitor's son grows up thinking that he'll also be a janitor. And then by the time he gets to college and graduates, he becomes a techie and makes a lot of money. And then all of a sudden, the bond between the father and the son is on in some way because now what do they have to connect on with their lives being so different? And the son has taken a different path. Will the father not accept the son anymore? Is the son afraid that the father won't be able to support him and his endeavors? Will there be jealousy? Like how is the relationship going to change now? And our hope is that with each generation, the next generation will be better than us in different ways. And every generation is going to break a cycle of some kind. But just knowing that doesn't mean that everyone's going to act in their highest and best good. There are some people who will struggle being happy for their children because the children are mirroring where the parents may not have believed in themselves or taken on a path that they really wanted to have. So these are really like real human dynamics that show up with others. In saying all of that, we've went through a lot of information today. Like we have literally been chatting about all the ways that we will belong to our families, even if it's not in our highest and best good. And you guys know, in each episode, I ask you guys a big question to think about. So one of the biggest questions that I will ask you today, due to any kind of unhealthy belonging, is, are you willing to risk your situation that you're in, that is not in your highest and best good, for the rest of your life, just because your need for belonging is so great? Like, are you willing to make less money than what you feel you are worth in a job because your need for belonging is so great because your family never made that much money? Are you willing to keep drinking alcohol even when you feel like you don't need to anymore or don't want to, just because your need for belonging is so great? Are you willing to keep choosing unavailable romantic partners, even though you deeply desire a healthy, connected, emotional relationship, just because your need for belonging is so great? So think about your own situation in your family with belonging, and I want you to fill in the blank. Are you willing to because your need for belonging is so great? I was talking to Tyler about this episode and how stoked I was to put it out, and he brought up something really interesting. He kind of simplified everything we've talked about today in one really unique sentence. And he said that he often thinks about moments in his life where he stopped being who he truly was just to fit in. Whether it's family or friends or a sports team we're on, school, relationships, like whatever. I know that I did that in many ways as a child. I, as a kid, was this like bubbly, fun, outgoing, goofy, dramatic, theatric kid who felt a lot all the time, and I felt a lot around me. And as I got older, that really seemed to be kind of too much for my family to handle. So many feelings and so many emotions, and being so intuitive, being able to feel everything around me as well. So I started to become afraid that I was going to be unlovable if I was who I was. So I started to dim that light. And now, as an adult, I've dimmed it so much to the point that when I teeter into the fullness of my expression with others, sometimes I immediately shut down because it doesn't feel safe. And it's been really hard for me to navigate that in my business as well, because I'm not just sharing the fullness of my expression with a close friend or my boyfriend or a family member. Now I'm scared to feel the fullness of my expression with like random clients that I'll meet who will book with me, or people on the podcast, or people who are scrolling through reels and see this on social media. This goes back to what I talked about earlier in the episode of like, can I allow people to see me in my fullest expression, given who I am and not holding back? So I continue to lean in and show up and show my inner child it's okay and it's safe, and I can still be bubbly and outgoing and goofy and theatric and passionate without needing to worry about like who I'm bothering or who I'm annoying. And in that, if I stop dimming my light and I allow myself to be the fullest expression of myself, some of my biggest fears are I'm going to annoy my family. My family's not going to accept me. They want me to be this, that, whatever. And that may not be the truth, but that's what I experienced as a kid. So that's the story still playing in my head. Meanwhile, I'm faced with situations all the time where my family wants my fullest expression, but I'm afraid to say it because what I experienced as a child was a far different experience than what I'm experiencing as an adult today. So that's where my work is around belonging, and other ways too. Other ways for sure. There are definitely topics on this week's episode that I am like, whew, speaking to myself. But in this week's episode, as always, please take what resonates and leave the rest. It's a really big episode. There's a lot of parts of this episode that may have felt like a lot of information. And if there's something in this week's episode that actually really resonated for you and you find yourself connecting with one of the topics, in this episode, please email me or DM me on Instagram. I would love to hear about what you find yourself struggling with, and maybe we can even dive into a session for you and see if there's any enmeshment or merging or entanglement through belonging that you're in and you may not even realize. And this is why I love family constellation therapy. We're able to bring awareness to a totally unconscious pattern that is keeping you stuck and help you experience freedom and liberation in it, because you don't have to carry your parents or your family's trauma. And my mission from day one with this work has always been to bring people the same hope and freedom and sovereignty that I experienced when I found family constellation therapy. And my mission and my purpose in this work is to show you all the ways that you are not your trauma. You are not your family's trauma. There are things that happen to them and to you, but they don't identify who you are. You are so much more than that, I promise, even if it doesn't feel like it, especially if it doesn't feel like it. I didn't get into this work because I read about it in a book or I studied it in school. I got into it because it transformed my life, and I hope that same transformation will be yours too. And I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. We're really getting into the nitty-gritty of FCT lately, and I'm loving sharing this information with you, and I've got tons more to share. So if you've got something out of this week's episode, I would really appreciate you rating the episode or just the channel as a whole, and subscribe, because I am dropping new episodes every week on Tuesdays, and you can watch them on Spotify or YouTube, or you can listen to them on Apple Podcasts. And if you leave a review of this episode or comment on YouTube, screenshot it and email me or DM me and show me, and I'll send you a little gift from me to you as a thank you. And I promise it's worth it. It's something I used to charge a lot of money for, and now I offer for free if you sign up for my email newsletters or if you review the podcast. So with that, I'll see you next week on the Healed Cat podcast on Tuesday. Have a great week, guys.